10 most dangerous bikes ever made. Motorcycles don't usually scare me. I've ridden some absolute monsters over the years, machines with more power than sense, bikes that demand everything from their rider. But even I've had moments where I genuinely question my life choices. Some motorcycles just have that thing, that unpredictable, almost sinister edge that keeps you on your toes. Whether it's raw power, sketchy handling, or a design flaw that makes every ride feel like a roll of the dice. Over time, a few of these bikes have earned the infamous Widowmaker title, some more deservedly than others. This list isn't just about the fastest or most powerful bikes I've ridden. It's about the ones that left me breathless, wide-eyed, and wondering how I made it through in one piece. Because sometimes the scariest bikes aren't just the ones that go fast, they're the ones that make you feel like you're barely hanging on. As I was putting this list together, one thing became clear. These bikes sound absolutely incredible. Whether it's the ear-splitting wail of a high-revving two-stroke, the guttural roar of a big V4, or the raw mechanical growl of a barely contained powerhouse, their exhaust notes are as much a part of their legend as their reputation for being downright terrifying. That's why I've made sure to include some of these fantastic exhaust notes in the video. You'll also notice that there aren't many modern bikes on this list. That's because today's motorcycles are designed to make life easier for the rider. With traction control, ABS, ride modes, and electronic safety nets, modern machines do a lot of the thinking for you. But the bikes on this list, they came from a different era. A time when motorcycle design was more about pushing limits than playing it safe. Newer bikes might be faster and pack more horsepower, but I wouldn't necessarily call them scary in the same way. They're engineered to be predictable, refined, and manageable, even when they're insanely fast. That's why most modern machines wouldn't quite fit on this list. Back in the day, chassis design and handling often felt like an afterthought, as if manufacturers were just strapping a monstrous engine to a frame and figuring out the rest later. These bikes had quirks, flaws, and outright death traps built into their DNA. There were no strict safety regulations, no environmental concerns holding manufacturers back. The only real limit was how far they were willing to push the envelope. And push it? They did. Before we get into looking at some of the most dangerous motorcycles out there, I would like to remind my new viewers to hit the subscribe button and press the bell icon to show your support, and join the Motorbike Classics family. Okay, now grab your beverage of choice and let's get into it. Number 1. The legendary Maiko 700. Topping the list is the absolute monster that is the Maiko 700. Originally built in the mid-80s and later resurrected between 2009 and 2014, this bike is still produced in very limited numbers today. And while modern versions may have slightly better brakes and suspensions, make no mistake, this thing is still a wild animal. The Maiko 700 was, and still is, one of the most terrifying two-stroke motorcycles ever built. It was a no-compromise machine designed to push the limits of both rider and machine. And if the massive 700cc two-stroke single wasn't enough, Maiko even experimented with a 760cc version, just in case you wanted to redefine your understanding of fear. Even today, variants of this engine dominate sidecar cross championships worldwide, proving just how brutally powerful it really is. The original bike had no rider aids, no electronics, and barely any weight to keep it planted, making it an unhinged experience on two wheels. I can't speak for the newer versions, but if they're anything like the originals, they're not the kind of bike you casually take for a Sunday ride. Very few bikes in history can match the sheer unfiltered adrenaline rush of riding a Maiko 700. I was lucky, or unlucky enough, to ride one once. I thought I could handle it. I was wrong. I never asked to ride it again. Next up, the Yamaha VMAX 1200. First released in 1985, the VMAX took Honda's V65 Magna, patted it on the head, and sent it off into obscurity. Yamaha didn't hold back when designing this machine. They took their V4 1200cc engine and went to work. Bigger intake and exhaust valves, aggressive camshafts, lighter pistons, and massive carburetors. But the real magic? The legendary V-Boost system. This servo-controlled intake system essentially acted like a hidden supercharger, kicking in at 6,000 RPM to flood the cylinders with extra fuel. The result? A brutal 145 horsepower, absolutely demolishing the Magna's 100 horsepower. And despite weighing a hefty 274 kilograms, The VMAX could rocket from 0 to 60 miles per hour in just 3.3 seconds. By the time you even processed what was happening, you were already at 100 miles per hour in 5 seconds. And if you dared to keep the throttle pinned, you'd be staring down 150 miles per hour before your brain caught up with your hands. After its explosive debut, the Yamaha VMAX 1200 quickly gained a reputation for being almost too wild, leading to power restrictions in many markets. Over the years, Yamaha gradually retuned the bike, and some versions didn't even get the legendary V-Boost system. But of course, die-hard fans weren't about to let that slide. Many found creative ways to bypass the restrictions and unleash the full fury of the original. Despite its straight-line dominance, the VMAX had some serious drawbacks. It was heavy, with big clunky cast wheels, making quick direction changes feel like steering a freight train. And then there were the brakes, or rather, the suggestion of brakes. The standard setup was wooden, vague, and massively underpowered, which led to more than a few scary moments for riders who underestimated just how fast this beast could accelerate. It quickly became a hooligan's motorcycle, a bike for riders who lived for that massive rush of power at 6,000 RPM and the relentless surge that carried it all the way past 9,000 RPM. The only real problem? Stopping it. Up next is the original Widowmaker, the Kawasaki H2 Mach 4. This wasn't just another fast motorcycle, it was a full-blown speed experiment with almost no regard for handling, braking, or rider survival. Back in 1971, Kawasaki didn't just break the rulebook when designing the 750cc 3-cylinder air-cooled two-stroke, they set it on fire. The only goal was speed, and on that front, they succeeded. With 75 horsepower, the H2 was the fastest production motorcycle in the world at the time. But speed wasn't the problem. The flexible frame and horrifically inadequate brakes were. In corners, the frame wobbled like a fishing rod in a storm. And the brakes? They were bad in the dry and borderline suicidal in the wet. If you misjudged a turn, you had two options: pray or prepare for impact. While 75 horsepower might not sound like much by today's standards, the real kicker was the 77 Newton-meter of torque that hit like a freight train at 6,500 RPM. The power delivery was savage and completely unforgiving, making it one of the most unpredictable motorcycles ever built. Kawasaki did try to tame it a little after 1974, adding a longer swing arm and revised geometry. But let's be honest, this bike never handled well. It was a machine that demanded respect, and if you didn't give it any, it would take you out. Next up is the Suzuki TL1000R. If the TL1000S was already considered a handful, Suzuki cranked things up even further with the TL1000R, turning it into an absolute beast of a motorcycle. At its heart was a 134 horsepower V-twin, the most powerful of its kind at the time. While it was relatively smooth above 5,000 RPM, from there it unleashed a relentless surge of torque that carried all the way past 9,000 RPM, and it never seemed to run out of steam. The power was incredible, but the problem was everything surrounding it. Suzuki built the TL1000R with an ultra-short wheelbase and razor-sharp steering geometry, making it incredibly twitchy, especially at high speeds. And then there was the rear suspension, which was, let's just say, questionable at best. Suzuki had attempted a rotary damper system, but it still didn't exactly inspire confidence, and the handling could be unpredictable in all the wrong ways. They eventually added a steering damper to try to tame it, but at the end of the day, the chassis simply wasn't up to the job of containing that monstrous V-twin engine. Up next is the Quasar. Every list needs a wild card, and here's mine. The Quasar, a truly bizarre attempt at rethinking what a motorcycle could be. Built in England in the late 70s, the Quasar was a feet-forward motorcycle, meaning instead of straddling it like a traditional bike, you sat inside it, almost like a recumbent cockpit on two wheels. Wrapped in a full fiberglass body shell, the Quasar definitely stood out. The enclosed design offered some weather protection, but the low seating position made it feel claustrophobic and nerve-wracking, especially in traffic, where visibility was a serious issue. Its low center of gravity and hub-centered steering should have made it stable, but instead it lacked any real feedback, so when things started to go sideways, there was little to no warning. The handling was awkward, the turning circle was massive, and while it had excellent aerodynamics, it felt more like piloting a spaceship than riding a motorcycle. Underneath it all, the Quasar was powered by a 750cc, 4-cylinder, Reliant car engine, which gave it decent cruising ability. It could comfortably hold 100 miles per hour indefinitely, eventually topping out at around 110 miles per hour. It was built in Bristol, but due to financial struggles, only about 6 were ever made between 1976 and 1979. Later versions experimented with different engines, but the Quasar never caught on. It was too odd for bikers, yet too exposed for car drivers. In the end, it was an engineering curiosity, rather than a revolution. Next up, the Suzuki RG500 Gamma. The undisputed king of the 1980s race replicas, the 1986 Suzuki RG500 Gamma was essentially a road-going version of Suzuki's Grand Prix race bike. The same kind of machine piloted by Barry Sheene, Tom Herron, Marco Lucinelli, and Steve Parrish, to name a few. With more power than the Yamaha RD500 LC, the Gamma had a fantastic chassis and solid brakes, on paper at least. So why was it so downright terrifying? Simple. The power band was an absolute time bomb. Anyone who's ridden one knows that below 6,000 RPM, there was almost nothing. It felt like the bike had forgotten it even had an engine. The rev counter didn't even bother marking anything below 3,000 RPM. But the moment you crossed 9,000 RPM, all hell broke loose. At 9,500 RPM, you got a small dip, the calm before the storm. If you shifted at the right time, you could keep it under control. But if you hesitated, at 9,600 RPM, the bike would launch you into hyperspace, revving past 12,000 RPM in a heartbeat and taking you straight past the supposed 147 miles per hour top speed. Next up, the Suzuki TM400 Cyclone. In 1971, Suzuki set out to build the most powerful motocross bike they could. What they ended up with was the TM400 Cyclone, a machine so unpredictable and dangerous that it became one of the most infamous dirt bikes ever made. The problem? It was too much for its own good. The frame was so lightweight that it simply couldn't handle the engine's raw power. Even without the extreme demands of motocross, it was prone to flexing and bending under stress, making the handling feel completely unstable. And then there was the engine. A 40 horsepower single-cylinder monster that was tuned way beyond what it should have been. But the real nightmare? It never ran consistently. Thanks to an unreliable ignition system and extreme tuning, power delivery was completely unpredictable. It could kick in anywhere between 3,500 and 5,000 RPM, and when it did, you either hung on for dear life or got launched into orbit. Later, Suzuki introduced the TS400, which was built heavier and came with a detuned engine, but even that was still a handful. So you can only imagine how terrifying the original TM400 Cyclone was. Next, we have the Harley-Davidson V-Rod. This bike might not be the first one that comes to mind when you think of terrifying motorcycles. But as I've said before, scary comes in many forms. This was a machine that was both Harley's most powerful bike at the time and one of its most flawed. Developed with the help of Porsche, the liquid-cooled V-twin engine in the V-Rod was one of the best Harley ever built, smooth, powerful, and a massive step forward for the brand. But no amount of horsepower could save it from one serious design flaw that made riding it an unpredictable gamble. The low-slung design meant that lean angles were severely limited, just 30 degrees, which made even the most gentle corners feel like a challenge. But that wasn't the real problem. The real nightmare scenario came from a cantilevered section just in front of the rear tire. If you happened to hit a bump mid-corner, the rear suspension could compress just enough for the subframe to lift the rear wheel off the ground, completely breaking traction and sending you sliding across the pavement without a second of warning. One moment you're leaning into a turn, the next you're on your ass, wondering what the hell just happened. That one engineering oversight is what earns the V-Rod a spot on this list, because when a bike can randomly decide to eject you onto the road, it's not just a power cruiser, it's a rolling hazard. Next up is the 1980s Turbo Experiment. In the mid-80s, the big four Japanese manufacturers became obsessed with turbochargers. They were determined to make them work on motorcycles, no matter what. Kawasaki gave us the GPZ750 Turbo, Suzuki rolled out the XN85, Honda experimented with the CX500 Turbo, and Yamaha introduced the XJ650 Turbo. Now, Suzuki was still licking its wounds from the financial disaster that was the RE5 rotary engine bike, so the XN85 didn't exactly get the royal treatment in terms of funding. But honestly, none of these bikes were great. Sure, they had power, plenty of it, but the added weight from the turbo setup made them cumbersome, and the technology just wasn't refined enough yet. What worked for big diesel engines didn't translate well to motorcycles. Each of these bikes had their own quirks, but the biggest issue? Heat. Turbochargers run hot, and keeping all that heat away from, well, you, was no easy task. Picture a Formula One engine stuffed into a hippo. That's about what riding one of these felt like. And if you weren't careful, it could turn into a very painful experience very quickly. And finally, the Suzuki X7. Alright Suzuki, I swear I'm not picking on you, but you've made this list more than any other manufacturer. And for good reason. The X7 was fast, cheap, and lightweight, but it was also incredibly temperamental. It had a nasty habit of shaking its head violently under acceleration, and the front wheel loved to lift off the ground, with even the slightest twist of the throttle. For an experienced rider, that might sound fun, but for a learner rider in the 1970s, it was terrifying. At the time, learner rider regulations allowed anything up to 250 cc's, so young riders flocked to the X7 as a cheaper alternative to the RD250. But if you couldn't afford an X7, Suzuki had you covered, with an even smaller, lighter, and arguably more dangerous model, the X5. Despite its smaller engine, the X5 could keep up with the 250s in real-world riding. However, the problem was that it was even more prone to the same handling issues as the X7. And in an era where tire technology was nowhere near as advanced as today, many young riders found themselves buried in a ditch, wondering what had just happened when they thought they had everything under control. For a so-called learner-friendly bike, the X7 had a funny way of teaching brutal lessons. I hope this trip down memory lane has brought back some wild memories for you, because it definitely has for me. Revisiting these beasts that left an unforgettable mark on my riding journey has been both thrilling and slightly terrifying. Of course, I know I might have missed a few, and that's where you come in. I want to hear from you. Which motorcycles would make your personal list of the most lethal, unhinged machines ever built? Were there any bikes that had you white-knuckling the handlebars, wondering how you made it out alive? Until next time, ride safe, ride fast, and keep chasing the horizon. See you in the next video.